All right, Andrew, whenever you're ready to begin.
Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first joint Climate-Eval and Sea Change webinar. My name is Andrew Zubiri and I am the moderator for Climate-Eval Community of Practice on Evaluating Climate Change and Development out of the GEF Evaluation Office. I am joined today by Saria Sok, the team leader of Sea Change, Southeast Asia Community of Practice for Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Interventions. Sea Change is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and supported by PAC Institute. Now I'd like to ask Rob D. Vandenberg, Director of the GEF Evaluation Office, to share with us his welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, probably. I don't know where you are all over the world. I am Rob Vandenberg, as Andrew introduced me, and I'm the Director of the GEF Evaluation Office. We are proud to support and host the Climate-Eval Community of Practice, and I'm pleased to welcome all the participants in today's webinar on Learning to Adapt by Paula Silva Villanueva. Paula's presentation explores the nexus of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, development, monitoring and evaluation. Confounding challenges still persist on our understanding and treatment of these topics, and disaster risk reduction has always been a difficult subject. Now I add another layer to this by introducing climate change as a factor that needs to be taken into account. And then start thinking how to monitor and evaluate the interventions that focus on these issues. Paula will help us think this through. What does it all mean and how do we reflect in our practice similarities, differences and overlaps of these intertwined concepts, actors and institutions? Her effort is not the only one. Many organizations and individuals have taken up and are working on this theme. In fact, the last Climate-Eval webinar about the study on M&E frameworks for adaptation touched on this. Learning to adapt adds to our knowledge on this very important topic. This webinar is special on three counts. First of all, this is the first webinar that emerged from the community of practice itself. It started with a post about the Learning to Adapt discussion paper on the Climate-Eval linked group by Paula. And Saria of Sea Change suggested to hold the webinar, and Saria and Andrew got down to work in preparation for today's presentation. It is the type of collaboration and knowledge sharing on which communities of practice like Sea Change and Climate-Eval are built. And secondly, as Andrew pointed out, this webinar is also special because it is the first joint webinar between Sea Change and Climate-Eval. This affirms the vibrant partnership between the two communities of practice that work on climate change and evaluation. Sea Change at the regional level and Climate-Eval at the global level. Holding the webinar today, October 12th, is the third specialty we organized for you. For today is the United Nations International Day for Natural Disaster Reduction, so this is a very timely webinar. I would like to thank you in advance for your participation in this webinar, and I hope you will have an intellectually challenging presentation and a stimulating debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob. I now turn to Saria to give us a few notes on today's session. Saria?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Andrew. Before we get started, I'd like to make a note of a few housekeeping items. First, if you experience any audio difficulties, please log off and log back into the webinar using the unique link that you received when you first registered. This should address technical issues that may occur. Please also note that all participants are in listen-only mode. This will help us reduce sound issues that you may encounter. There is not a list of participants in your dashboard, and this is due to the requested privacy of other participants. The last note that I will raise is that participants are strongly encouraged to make a note of your questions during the presentation. It is during the question and answer session when we would encourage you also to type in your question into the window pane in the lower right-hand side of the control panel. We'll unmute the microphone for participants who would like to verbally ask a question by clicking on the raise hand icon. And this is also located on your control panel. It is the very last icon, just hanging off onto the left side. And of course, before you ask your question, please state your name and your affiliated organization. And now I'd like to go over quickly what we'll cover in today's webinar and also introduce our presenter, Paula Silva Villanueva. With over 8 years working at the Research Policy Practice Interface, Paula brings substantial experience in climate change adaptation and disaster risk management predominantly in Asia. As an independent consultant and technical M&E advisor of the Strengthening Climate Resilience Consortium at IDS, Paula is currently developing an M&E methodology for integration of climate change adaptation, disaster risk management under the Strengthening Climate Resilience Program, which is in partnership with IDS, Christian Aid, and Plan International. This follows a substantial engagement as a consultant with the Climate Change and Development Center at IDS and also 5 years as a senior program officer at SEEDS, where she was responsible for coordination and implementation of multi-country programs in South Asia on disaster risk reduction. Paula has been involved in supporting disaster management plans at the state level in India and in the Maldives. She earned her MA in Development Studies with a focus on climate change adaptation from the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, and her undergraduate was in Business Management in her native country, Spain, at the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Currently, her research and practice focuses on the issues at the interface between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and development with particular attention to monitoring and evaluation, which gives you here the working paper that Paula will be presenting, Learning to Adapt, Exploring, Monitoring, and Evaluation Approaches in Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction, Challenges, Gaps, and Ways Forward. She is also a co-author of the Monitoring and Evaluation of Progress in Adaptation to Climate Change, Advances, Challenges, and Ways Forward. This is a chapter in a book that is forthcoming in a publication led by IIED. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Paula. Thanks all for joining us today.
Hi Andrew, hi Saria, and hi everyone. Let me first thank the Climate-Eval community and the SEA Change for bringing us all together today, and I hope you'll enjoy the presentation and we will have very fruitful discussions. I would also like to thank Rob for his welcome remarks. As mentioned by Saria, I will be presenting the research findings of this discussion paper that looked at M&E from adaptation and DRR perspective. This was a desk-based review of existing approaches in adaptation, but with a special emphasis on understanding to what extent this actually provides a space for learning and deepening our understanding of the progress made in adaptation. And to do so, it actually reviewed and analyzed the methodologies and indicators used, but also it questioned the assumptions behind those approaches. As we will see, they become very critical in framing our M&E efforts. And findings, a key message emerging from this paper is that we need to take M&E for adaptation and DRR beyond business as usual, which actually means challenging conventional M&E practice in a changing climate, and therefore need for a new understanding and interpretation of monitoring and evaluation. And to what I will do in the next 20 or 25 minutes, I will take you through the three key sections of the paper look at the challenges, especially when we understand adaptation at the interface of DRR and development, but also more of the technical challenges that arise in working in a changing climate. And from then we will look at the analysis and the review of current efforts, and we will see how, after an understanding of what the challenges are, we can identify three key issues in current practice that may need to be addressed. And finally, as a way forward, and with the objective of trying to move the M&E adaptation debate forward, I will present what I suggest as the ADAPT principles and recommendations for future practice. I think it's important when we discuss about M&E and adaptation to understand it and to look at it at the interface of these three domains of work. And this is in recognition of the increasing calls for integrating DRR, adaptation and development, understanding that reducing future disaster risk and adapting to a changing climate calls for understanding and addressing the underlying causes of vulnerability and poverty, such as all the socioeconomic and political factors that play a critical role, and therefore the direct link for mainstreaming adaptation and DRR in broader developmental efforts. However, what is very surprising is that in spite of the calls in recent years about taking DRR and development beyond business as usual and integrating these three domains of work, the debate has not addressed yet what would that mean for M&E. In other words, what is it that we need to do differently in monitoring and evaluation practice if we should aim for integration and understanding adaptation from a broader perspective. From a positive point of view, we can actually say that if we understand and acknowledge the overlaps and synergies between these three domains of work, that actually can already provide us very useful insights for the development of M&E in adaptation. But even more, it can also help M&E to contribute to fostering the integration of these three domains of work, which is one of the purposes of this paper. However, for that to happen, for having M&E frameworks that allow us to understand adaptation from a broader perspective and foster integration, we need to understand M&E first from an integrated perspective and to reflect the multidimensional nature of adaptation and DRR beyond disaster impacts and risk, but their contribution to developmental outcomes. And within this context of the need for integration and understanding adaptation from this broader perspective, we also need to understand what are actually the M&E challenges in working in climate change, and also to start thinking of what the implications may be for M&E practice. What you have now at the front of you are a list of the key characteristics and the context within which M&E is going to take place. The list could be much longer. I here highlight what I consider to be key issues. As you will see, the first four characteristics or issues are the most that have been widely discussed, whereas the last three are the ones that I think that have not been addressed yet so far, but as I will argue, these are critical for the implementation and successful implementation of adaptation. The first 4 points are all interlinked. I think the lack of conceptual clarity of what adaptation is, its overlaps with DRR and adaptation, not knowing yet what works and what does not work in practice, calls for M&E frameworks that allow and provide space for learning and deepening our understanding, which is the main focus of this presentation, but also the understanding that adaptation may mean different things at different places, and therefore we may need M&E frameworks that are diverse and a diverse set of indicators that are actually context specific and reflect local realities and local challenges. But even more is what the UNDP has called the tracking moving targets, and understanding that adaptation and development efforts will happen against evolving hazards, but not only that, that the main variables or the key variables that we will need to look in adaptation, which are adaptive capacity and vulnerability, will always be changing in this, again, changing context. And therefore, rather than one-off evaluations, we may need continuously monitor those variables and the changes on the ground. Which leads us to the fourth challenge, which is the long time frame related to adaptation, and that benefits of current efforts may be seen in decades to come, and therefore we need many frameworks and approaches that run over long periods of time. But I think equally important is a need to acknowledge that in spite of the lack of conceptual clarity and understanding and so forth and so on, adaptation, independently of how we define it, entails a decision-making process at different scales. It entails changing perhaps livelihoods, changing economic growth pathways, and so forth and so on. And therefore, understanding that decision-making process and capturing the determinants that may influence those processes are key in order to contribute to moving adaptation forward. For example, issues around values, interests, behavior, culture, religion, all these may play a critical role in our decision-making process. This has long been highlighted by the IPCC and several authors, and including the World Bank guidelines for M&E and adaptation. And therefore, we need to make sure that those are captured somehow in M&E. And of course, participatory across scales, and how do we deal with the interactions and interdependencies between the decisions taken at different places and at different times, which link us to a very critical challenge again, which is issues about maladaptation. If we want to measure how successful adaptation has been, that also entails that adaptation can be unsuccessful and can bring unintended consequences both in the environment and on communities, which links us again to what I was saying before, which is the need for integrated frameworks that reflect a holistic understanding of adaptation, DRR, their overlaps and synergies with broader development efforts, and therefore the need for strong feedback loops, especially in an area where many potential trade-offs may arise in the decision-making process. The need to negotiate between short-term versus long-term benefits and losses, which take us to the last and final challenges that I think it's important, which is that we need to deal with uncertainty. We are uncertain of what decisions may be taken and by who and by what this may be determined. We do not know what the unintended consequences of some intervention may be, and therefore beyond climatic predictions and beyond having to discuss how to ensure that we have robust decision-making processes in place, there is the need to acknowledge that there is much more uncertainty also in relation to the interdependencies between, for example, ecosystem services, livelihoods, economic pathways, and so forth and so on. And therefore, we need flexible and dynamic M&E approaches that allow a space for bringing in new information as this becomes available. And if you can keep these keywords in the back of your mind for the rest of the presentation: learning, diverse, context-specific, continuous, long-term, process-based, determinants of decision-making, participatory, integrated, flexible, and dynamic, it's from these keywords that we then go and look at what the existing approaches are. And as you will see, we can clearly identify key gaps emerging. Because of time constraints, I will not go into detail of the analysis that was conducted. You have full information and description on the paper. What you see in front of you is the way I've categorized existing methodologies in the first column. So we have methodologies trying to understand what are the inputs required in adaptation, and therefore what are the outputs and outcomes that we would like to see on the ground. However, many approaches in development have just started to emerge, and we don't have yet outcome evaluations available. And this is the most conventional type of evaluation, as it follows the log frame thinking, which is what most organizations tend to follow. But we also have kind of different approaches, like process-based evaluation. We can see this, for example, in the UK, the DEFRA department, which acknowledges that actually, because of the uncertainty that characterizes the environment within which we live, we can maybe focus on the processes that are required rather than unpredictable outcomes. We also have methodologies trying to evaluate behavioral changes. This emerges from outcome mapping thinking. And of course, from the economic perspective, we also have economic evaluations in place, although these have mostly taken place at the international and national levels, and we have a few initiatives conducting economic evaluations on the ground. And we will go through each of the columns in the next following slides, but I would like to emphasize that the key focus of the current methodologies remain on effectiveness and efficiency, understanding effectiveness to the extent to which these projects are able to reach the objectives that they were set out to achieve, and also efficiency, that is the use of resources and the value for money of each of these evaluations. And if we could actually bring the column of the keywords for the implications of M&E and overlap it and put it on top of this one can see that there are many keywords missing from this table. But I think that there are three key common issues that are most problematic. This is not to say that current methodologies are not useful. Actually, they are very useful in helping us to identify the technical issues, what may be required in terms of adaptation interventions, but they may fall short in helping us to better understand adaptation and progress made. In the first place, because they appear to be very deterministic and linear, and assuming that from the outset we can determine what are the inputs and outputs required, and disassociating them from processes, one of the keywords that came up before. And these are actually predetermined from the outset and from a particular context. They also tend to be very static, especially when we look, if we look at evaluations and the methodologies, stressing and before and after comparison. Again, we saw before that a continuous M&E might be required. But also the problem with the static indicators is that they tend to focus on the delivery of those inputs and outputs rather than on the long-term change and the potential unintended consequences of those adaptations. And finally, the overemphasis on effectiveness and efficiency in the short term. Let's not forget that most of the program and projects remain short-term focused, and where the basket of indicators in these approaches remain limited to issues around risk and exposure to a particular hazard, but they do not reflect a broader set of indicators that can actually help us to understand potential maladaptation, such as, for example, distribution of vulnerability, issues of governance, access to resources, etc. And as a result, they seem to be detached from the wider political economic context where adaptation is taking place, and that, as we saw before, is critical in determining the success of adaptation interventions. So we can actually see that we already have a key set of issues missing or understanding missing from current approaches. First, we can see that there is no attention, or maybe very little, into capturing decision-making processes. In this slide, I highlight household level, but we could apply this at any level. Then the orientation towards learning and acknowledging that our understanding is still limited is overridden by an orientation towards measuring effectiveness and efficiency, and where the linkages between capacity and action and change are not taken into consideration, but even more, how those three variables are dependent on the broader operational environment within which communities live are not considered. For example, most of the evaluations tend to look at how many people were trained, do we have plans in place, do we have seasonal forecasts, have we established early warning systems. But to the extent to which those are used, why are they used, why are they effective or not, are not taken into consideration. And I think as a result, the dynamics and the complexity of adaptation and change is completely forgotten. And as one of the persons interviewed for this research said, outputs are too limited, outputs don't tell us much about adaptation, but at the same time outcomes are too unpredictable, and therefore by looking at outputs and outcomes only, we are missing the complex environment within which we live. And I think we can explain that by saying that we are still understanding adaptation and BRR outside the context of multiple stressors and the political economy. And therefore the potential trade-offs and maladaptation pathways are not being captured, which actually ask us to question the quality of current adaptation interventions. However, this is quite contradictory to the way I started my presentation, because I've said that there is increasing recognition for the need of integration, increasing recognition for understanding BRR and development and adaptation from a broader perspective. But this has not translated yet into M&E practice. And if one tries to understand why M&E methodology continues to be very conventional and we continue to apply these kind of methodologies, I think one way of explaining this is by looking at the assumptions and ways of working in M&E. And I think the dominance of top-down identification of indicators is translating into checklists, thinking and describing adaptation in a very narrow and linear way. The assumption, especially in the economics field, but I think we could apply this to all evaluations in relation to assuming that individuals take rational decisions, in spite of the fact that there are numerous research studies highlighting how behavior, culture, perceptions of risk play a critical role in taking decisions and in the adaptation agenda. This is even strongly put by several authors. There seems to be this assumption that actually we know what is required, we know what we need to measure, and we know what's going to happen. And as we saw before, uncertainty is one of the key variables that defines the context, the current context within which we are working. And maybe it's time to assume that actually there is a lot that we don't know and how we can deal with this in M&E. And this actually has an effect on our cost-effect thinking. If we provide these inputs, then we will achieve certain outputs, which then will take us to certain outcomes. And there is plenty empirical evidence that demonstrates that cost-effect and linear thinking in development is flawed. But I think the overarching idea or perception of the way we are approaching M&E is that the role we are seeing in M&E as a tracking tool that has to demonstrate impact is a tool that tells us how good we are in our work, and therefore the opportunity that M&E offers for understanding adaptation has so far largely been ignored. And I think from a perspective of wanting to contribute to this discussion of M&E and adaptation, and acknowledging again that adaptation means different things at different places, rather than getting trapped into discussions about what type of indicators, what is the framework that could work, I think the first step, is to rethink how we are positioning and how we practice monitoring and evaluation, and then maybe we could move the discussion forward. Rethinking M&E in a way that is not just a tool for tracking progress, which it can be quite helpful for that, but it has to be seen as iterative approach, where learning, flexibility, and enhancing our capacity to deal with uncertainty remain key. But also, M&E can open spaces for discussion and negotiation in an area where decision-making processes are so critical and the potential trade-offs so large. And to do that, we need that the purpose of M&E to remain, to promote, and to support knowledge promotion, informed decision making, and in this context, support space for innovation. And if we want to discuss about indicators, then I think my position on that will be that we need indicators that reflect the interacting processes, stresses, and all the dimensions of decision making, meaning that we need, again, an integrated and a broader understanding of adaptation, DRR, and development beyond a particular program or project deadline or target area. And one could say, well, actually, this is easier said than done. There have been many calls challenging mainstream M&E practice, especially, for example, from people working in capacity development. So in order to help organizations, project managers, policymakers to deal with this issue, I think it's what we need is a set of principles that can guide the development of M&E approaches and frameworks, which then can take different forms, can involve different indicators depending on where you are and at what scale you work. But I think that adaptive learning and adaptive management has to remain a critical principle when working in M&E, recognizing that experience-based learning and dealing with uncertainty has to remain a critical characteristic of any M&E framework for adaptation. But to support adaptive learning and management, we need dynamic baselines in place that recognize the changing conditions of adaptive capacity and vulnerability, and therefore are ready to provide real-time feedback for corrective action and avoiding maladaptation. They need to be active in understanding. As I said before, most methodologies remain focused on measuring states. That is, we have plans, we have technology, we have so forth and so on. But we have to recognize that the different values and interests of different actors at different scales will play a critical role in the decisions that may be taken, and therefore progress in adaptation. And because of the different values and interests, we need participatory M&E approaches rather than top-down identification of what success is, recognizing that adaptation is context-specific and there is a need for triangulation of information and decision-making across scales. And finally, and I think the most important one, is that they have to be thorough, which links us again with the need for a broader understanding of adaptation and the integration of these three domains of work, especially in order to evaluate potential trade-offs, to take into consideration unintended consequences that we are uncertain of what those may be, but we have to recognize there are multiple stresses and processes across scales, and we need to take those on board. And I think the purpose of the ADAPT principles is not to increase the number of frameworks, it's not to increase the number of indicators, but just to ensure that the quality of the M&E methodologies used is as high as we can, and that they reflect the complexities, the uncertainty, and the local realities of adaptation. The paper also proposes a set of recommendations that I will not go through at the moment. Maybe the ones I would like to highlight for this presentation is that we need to develop tools that are based on monitoring and evaluation approaches for the generation of an evidence base of what works and what does not work, why and why not, and broadening our understanding of adaptation and its processes. And also I think it's time for the adaptation community and the DRR community especially to engage with development practitioners and to develop comprehensive integrated basket of indicators that account for the wider operational environment. And finally, as I was saying before, the findings of this paper and its suggestions add weight to the long calls challenging conventional M&E practice, and there are outside methodologies for dealing with uncertainty and complexity from an M&E perspective, such as utilization focus and developmental evaluations. They are out there, and it's time for us to engage with them. And as final remarks of this presentation, before I finish, I would like to stress the point that we cannot evaluate adaptation and DRR without considering their multidimensional nature and the processes of change, especially from a decision-making perspective, and that we need to shift the role of M&E for contributing to a greater understanding and improving practice. And as I started with the presentation, M&E has to go beyond business as usual. We have to challenge conventional practice on M&E if we want to ensure and contribute and support communities to adapt to a changing climate. And that once we have a clear purpose in mind for M&E, then the technical challenges that we've discussed could be reduced for learning. And finally, I'd like to finish my presentation with a question to you, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot since I developed the ADAPT principles, which is that we need to learn how to adapt, but it becomes very clear that what we need first is to change the way we work in this context, to change our M&E practice in order to allow adaptation to happen. And I think that climate change offers an opportunity to challenge and address some of the shortcomings of conventional M&E practice. And my question to you is, are we ready to take such challenge? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. That was a wonderful presentation and a great call to action. We will now shift to the audience participation and the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please indicate your name and your organization before stating your questions. And as a quick reminder, we'll be turning on the microphone for the participants who use the raise hand icon, which is at the right-hand side of the control panel. Otherwise, you may opt to pose your questions by entering them into the chat window. And in that window, Andrew will field your questions, and I will take care of questions that are raised, that are requested to be raised verbally if you are to use the raise hand icon. So please enter your questions in the question panel, or use the raise hand icon if you would like to be called on to pose your question.
Probably we can start with the question from
conventional baselines are set at the beginning of a program, and these are reviewed on quarterly or 6-monthly basis, and they are pretty static, looking at, for example, certain types of numbers rather than looking at the operational environment, what is changing, what are the factors having an impact on that context, and how does that then have an impact on our baselines. And therefore baselines first go beyond before and after comparison. They are regularly updated, and they do not just reflect a quantifying number of progress made in terms of trainings or achievements, but they give us an understanding on how the operational environment is changing and to what extent our efforts are being impacted by them. Thanks.
Thank you, Paula. We have another question from Magdalena Muya. Paula, can you please discuss possible use of social or socio-economic scenarios and interaction? I somehow cannot understand. With all levels of continuing, I think that's what she means. Oh, with all,
I don't.
sorry, let me read out that question again. Paula, can you please discuss possibility of social economic scenarios and interaction and interactive dialogue with all actors in society?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I do feel that socioeconomic scenarios are critical, not just in order to inform interventions, but to be a key part on our M&E practices, which leads again to the previous question of dynamic baselines. Those baselines have to reflect the changing conditions in the social and in the economical. And of course, those socio-economic scenarios have to reflect local realities at every level, and we need, as I was saying, spaces for discussion and negotiation of what is happening in the socio-economical context and what decisions are taking from an adaptation perspective in order to ensure that there are not unintended consequences or in terms, for example, in the distribution of socioeconomic benefits and losses in a particular region, community, or nation. I'm not sure I've answered the question, but that's what I would understand as critical from a socioeconomic scenario perspective.
All right. We have one question from Amadou Die from CSE Dakar, Senegal. How easy is it to scale up the NAPA to local communities? I understand NAPA as the National Adaptation Plan of Action.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think I reviewed some of the NAPAs a year ago, and one of the main contradictions was that in their narrative they stressed the need to reflect local conditions, but if one reads through the NAPAs, there is very limited participation or reflection on how the local communities understand adaptation and to what extent they're contributing to the development of the NAPAs. And I think that's what the thoroughness as a principle and bringing different actors from different scales at the same table to negotiate future actions, but even more potential trade-offs are critical. And therefore, I'm a bit skeptic on the situation of some NAPAs being, again, a top-down exercise that do not reflect the needs of local populations, neither their perceptions or what they consider maybe to be successful. Thank you. Andrew?
All right, we have another question from Orlan Ocliasa from the Philippines. How will you link the M&E for CCA, or climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction in the theory of complexity?
In the theory, oh, that's that's a very good question, and I don't think that will be a very long discussion here. But I think that acknowledging theories of complexity, and again, as I was trying to stress, the issues around interdependencies and multi-scalar decision-making processes, and coupled with uncertainty both in climate prediction and the socio-economic impacts, needs to be a key principle. And I think theory of complexity has not been embraced neither by the DRR and adaptation community yet, and I think that will be an incredible exercise to do, and it will be very interesting to see that. But as I was saying, it's time for us to engage with such. I have to say also that disaster risk reduction, the experience in M&E and DRR is also very limited, in spite of the calls for using DRR frameworks for adaptation. We cannot forget that DRR M&E is also full of very critical technical challenges, and rather than addressing those and understanding the complexity involved in DRR, we have ended up with input and output based indicators that don't tell us much about what risk reduction means, again, at the local level. So I would be very interested to see such an exercise on using complexity theory for understanding DRR and adaptation, but unfortunately, I don't think you know, a 1 minute answer can actually deal with that. But I will be more than happy to discuss that after the webinar or on another time.
Okay. Great, thank you, Paula. We now have a question from Kelly Harrelson. She, I believe, is from Plan International. Kelly, are you with us?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hello? Hi, thank you, Paula, for this very challenging presentation and challenging us to stop doing what doesn't work. I just want to ask quickly if you have any examples of the application of the ADAPT principles in practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Once someone told me that, you know, the ADAPT principles are very difficult to disagree with, but unless you can use them, they may remain ideals rather than principles. And I think this year has been very challenging with the Strengthening Climate Resilience Consortium, with IDS, the Christian Aid and Plan, looking at the climate-smart disaster risk management approach, which is an approach that actually it's driving towards the integration of DRR, adaptation, and development. And this year we've been working to develop actually an M&E methodology using the ADAPT principles. And some examples are, for example, if one wants to foster, for example, adaptive learning and thoroughness and dynamic baselines, the first step we did was to bring in planning at the center of M&E. For some of you, this may be quite obvious because planning, monitoring, and evaluation from its origins were 3 interconnected events. However, in most practice, they have been disconnected. But planning actually can play a critical role, for example, in ensuring that we establish dynamic baselines, we have feedback loops in place, and that as new knowledge becomes available, we bring this into our monitoring stage, which then again inform our planning. In relation of thoroughness, for example, the climate-smart disaster risk management approach has collected indicators across these 3 domains of work from a decision-making perspective, and therefore identifying what processes overlap in these 3 domains of work, and also what are the potential trade-offs. So when people are driving towards integration, by using the ADAPT principles, and especially thoroughness as a key principle, managers and policymakers can understand or can actually take into consideration potential trade-offs, and again take corrective action as soon as unintended consequences become visible. And I think it's also active, the active principle, for example, in understanding all the indicators are framed in a way that issues such as perception of risk, culture, behavior, and so forth and so on are taken into consideration, for example, at the monitoring stage, to make sure that rather than imposing a set of interventions, we are actually understanding how those determinants play a critical role in that. And participatory, again, by bringing on the same table DRR, adaptation, and development practitioners and actors across different scales, trying to negotiate different values and interests. So I think the climate-smart disaster risk management approach has come a long way into bringing in the ADAPT principles from an indicators perspective, from a design perspective in terms of bringing planning, and from dynamic perspective, bringing into the monitoring stage a key of guiding questions that go beyond a particular project area, but try to capture how the operational environment is changing and how decisions taken by several actors may have an impact on the integration process. And I think if more people want more information about it, they can go to the Climate-Smart Disaster Risk Management website, and over there you have background papers and examples on how the ADAPT principles have been put into practice.
Thanks, Paula. We have one more question from Frank van Schobroek, working for Governance for Green Agriculture in the Netherlands. On the one hand, there is the result outcomes of adaptation. On the other hand, the institutional processes behind these results. Do I understand that you propose to monitor and evaluate them together dynamically rather than only the result part?
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea is that if we focus again our understanding of M&E on improving our learning and understanding of what adaptation is, we need to equally look at both, at what are the institutional processes, what are the different actors, and what are the determinants affecting the decisions they are taking, and also, of course, towards what kind of outcome are they driving to. And therefore, for example, in the example I was giving before, in the climate smart disaster risk management approach, what we've done, we have an integrated basket of both set of processes that may need to be evaluated, and also intermediate outcomes, acknowledging from the outset that because of the uncertainty and lack of knowledge, we cannot determine today what the outcomes may be, but we have a set of intermediate outcomes that may need to be evaluated, again, on the context of those institutional processes. So yeah, thank you very much for that comment, because that's exactly what this presentation is trying to say.
Okay, we have one question from Kristin Davis. Can you give more details or examples about how indicators can reflect multiple interacting processes and stressors, particularly at the household level?
Absolutely. I think that's a key question, and that much more research is required. And I think this question brings us again to the issue of integration. So, for example, we will need at the household level, the households are not just vulnerable to a particular climate change impacts, but also to issues of, I don't know, food security, water stress, access to resources, access to market, inequality, gender issues, so forth and so on. So all those multiple stressors in a particular context need to be captured both in our indicators and in our baselines. So, for example, in most conventional adaptation and DRR practice, baselines look at risk and vulnerability and capacity in the view of a particular hazard. The new dimension that this presentation is trying to put forward is that the socioeconomic issues in that particular household, the gender dynamics in that particular household, the access in that particular household, and so forth and so on, need to be taken into consideration. Of course, that will be different depending on the context, or in a conflict-sensitive area, or in a, depending on the country and on the household. But by dynamic and multiple stresses, I refer to those variables that put a stress on the well-being of a particular individual or household.
Thanks, Paula. I think we have time for one last question from Kristina Verlin. Can you expand on the thinking behind your last slide? In what ways could climate change help us overcome traditional limitations of M&E? How could the community approach this, and what would it take for us to be ready for this?
Thank you very much for this question. And the reason why I finished with this question for all of you is because whenever one goes to conferences or discusses about the challenges, I think that beyond all the technical challenges that we've discussed today, the main challenge is that the way we work and the way we are structured, the way the funding is given, the way organizations are divided, actually make the, putting the ADAPT principles in practice much more difficult. And the reason why I say that climate change offers an opportunity, I think this is, I don't know if this is a very strong argument, but I think many of the messages that are coming across from the climate change community are not new. And if one looks at the resilience thinking, if one looks at sustainable development, those messages have said for a very long time. But I think climate change offers an opportunity, first because it's top at the political agenda. It brings together all the countries to discuss how to face it, and therefore I think the door is open for challenging the way we've been working so far. Again, for me, the challenge remains to what extent are we ready to challenge conventional, traditional thinking, not only on M&E, but we could extend this in, again, the way organizations work, the way funding works, and so forth and so on. Because if one looks, for example, at one of the key principles that I think that is thoroughness, which is about integration and it's about bringing indicators together. The challenge is, for example, that finding silos. And it will be very difficult. You know, we have departments that fund adaptation, we have departments that fund gender issues, we have departments. So how do we bring that together? And therefore the challenge is not living in a changing climate. The challenge is rethinking the way we work and any innovative thinking of how we can actually open that door and use the floor and the political space available today are more than welcome, and I will be very happy to listen to any of your ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Paula. We actually have enough time for just one more question, and I'd like to invite Henri Noel Tanguay to please ask your question, and also please indicate which organization you may be affiliated with. Henri, are you there?
Yes. Are you getting me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Okay, I work with Plan International in Cameroon, somewhere in Africa, and I was very interested in the presentation, but I wanted to see, to know whether we can have a sample M&E in DRR that can be a source of inspiration as we try to adapt to the suggestions. Thank you.
Could you say, I didn't understand the question. Saria, did you get it?
Yeah, I wanted to find out whether you have conceived some M&E plans, surely, and I wanted to know whether in disaster risk reduction you have a sample that we could see and try to understand better what you're trying to bring out.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I guess this, yeah, no, you are completely right. Sometimes these discussions can be very abstract, and we need to see what it looks like in practice. As I was saying, the review looked at M&E plans and M&E frameworks, and all of them tend to have, you know, very similar, as I was saying, approaches, methodologies, and also templates. But in this particular program that I was telling you, the Climate Smart Disaster Risk Management approach under the SCR consortium has developed, we've been working on a guideline for actually developing planning, monitoring, and evaluation plans, both from an integration perspective, but also trying to put that principle in practice. And I think this guide will be available in the next 2 weeks. And again, in the website of the SCDRM, you can find the sample and a step-by-step process for you to look at and try to approach. Again, let me emphasize that the idea of the ADAPT principles and the work I have been doing with the SCR does not attempt to provide a template or a blueprint or a one-off solution, but it's rather, you know, a set of principles and approach that one can actually use in their ongoing efforts and rethink the way we are practicing M&E. So there is no template or as such, or rather, there is neither a checklist, but it provides guideline for you to navigate through this complexity of integration and monitoring and evaluation, and it gives you some guide on how to develop indicators, and it also provides you a sample of guiding questions for your monitoring stage and evaluation.
Great.
And again, this will be available online, I think, in the next 2 weeks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paula. That actually will wrap us up quite nicely. Thank you to all the webinar participants for joining us today and for sharing your questions and comments on this working paper. For those who may have joined a few minutes late, or if you had any difficulties with the audio, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be uploaded on www.csdrm.org. This is the site that Paula had mentioned earlier. There's an M&E group page, so please check that page for the information that we'll be uploading. Also, please feel free to share this link with your colleagues who are not able to join us today. Andrew?
We'd especially like to thank Paula for your wonderful presentation. We hope that the discussion today helps further develop the working paper. We encourage continued discussion online at www.csdrm.org. Again, that's www.csdrm.org. Before we close, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Rockefeller Foundation, the CEDA, the Ministry for Environment from the Swiss government, the Jeff Evaluation Office for supporting our respective communities of practice and making this webinar and other COP activities possible. We would also like to mention that we are taking note of the other questions we cannot accommodate in the Q&A, and we will try our best to address them via the forum or other means. Once again, we appreciate your participation. Please take a moment at the end of the webinar to share your thoughts with us through the evaluation survey. Have a wonderful day.